Hello, Nick Hodges here, Senior Developer at Gateway Ticketing Systems, and I'm here to talk to you today about dependency injection basics for today's developer skill sprint. This skill sprint will work with any Embarcadero development tool. The principles I'm talking about today are not specific to Delphi or any language or framework, so they'll work on all the platforms that Delphi and C++ support, as well as Appmethod. These principles will work for Object Pascal and C++, although I'll be doing all my demos in Object Pascal today. So here's what we're going to cover. We'll cover the basics of dependency injection. I'll have one slide that'll talk a little bit about it. Then I'll show you some demonstrations of code that show what's commonly referred to as poor man's DI, or poor man's dependency injection, which is a very simple technique, but a very powerful one. Then we'll leverage some interfaces to show you how interfaces can be used with dependency injection to separate you from the implementation of any particular class. And then I'll show you the proper use of a DI container, the right way to use them as opposed to the wrong way. So what is dependency injection? Well, dependency injection is really a $25 word that describes a 10-cent concept. Dependency injection is simply the notion of not letting classes create their own dependencies, but instead give a class its dependencies. It's that simple, really. There's really nothing more to it than that. It allows you to decouple your dependencies from any specific implementation. This allows you to create, for instance, testing classes that you can inject into your classes as dependencies to enable you to more easily and powerfully test your applications using unit testing. Okay, so at this point, let's just go right to the code demonstrations. Okay, here we are in Delphi XE8. I've got 5 demos. Each one builds on the previous one, and I'll show you them one at a time. The first demo is a pretty typical way of doing business in Delphi. We have 3 classes, a sprocket verifier, and a sprocket processor. The sprocket processor takes a sprocket and processes it using the sprocket verifier. Pretty simple stuff. We see this kind of class hierarchy all the time. Now, in the constructor, you'll see that we take a sprocket to be processed in the constructor as a parameter. We store it off, and then we create an instance of tsprocket verifier. Now, this is a very typical construction in Delphi. We create a sprocket verifier in the constructor of sprocket processor and then destroy it in the destructor. Pretty normal. However, if you stop and think about it, what we've done is we've tightly coupled ourselves to the specific implementation of tsprocket verifier, and that is something that we want to avoid. So in the next demo, we'll see how we can take a step towards avoiding that. Okay, so here we have the second version of the demo, and you'll notice that it's got the same 3 classes as before, only this time the constructor takes as a parameter an instance of tsprocket verifier, and then the constructor looks like this. It simply checks to make sure that it's not past nil, anything nil. Those are called guard functions. And it stores the sprocket and the sprocket verifier off for later use. So when you call process sprocket, you can use the fsprocket verifier instance to verify the sprocket and process it completely. So what we've done here is we've eliminated the specific dependency on a given instance of tsprocket verifier and allowed you to pass that instance into the class. And this is the very basic form of what's called constructor injection. And in a sense, I could stop the talk right here, because that is the essence of dependency injection. You give the class the implementation of the class it needs. You don't create it yourself. And so that's the basic premise of constructor injection and dependency injection in general. And now we have our third demo. And in this demo, we're even further abstracting away the notion of what a sprocket verifier are. We've created a demo interfaces unit that defines 3 interfaces, 2 of which we'll use in this demo, the iSprocket and iSprocket verifier interfaces. We then implement those interfaces using the tsprocket and the tsprocket verifier classes. And instead of passing in actual instances of those classes to the tsprocket processor, we are going to pass in interfaces, thus further insulating ourselves away from any particular implementation and instead coupling ourselves to an interface, which, as I've said before, is kind of like trying to grab onto a wisp of smoke. It's really nothing. It's really just a declaration of an implementation. Now we have truly completely separated ourselves from the implementation of the sprocket verifier. So when we look at how this particular class is implemented, you'll notice that we declare two interfaces and a sprocket processor. We create the sprocket and sprocket verifier, and we pass those interface implementations into the sprocket processor, which in turn processes the sprockets. So we've completely decoupled the sprocket processor from any particular implementation. We could implement any kind of sprocket we wanted, any kind of sprocket verifier we wanted here, and pass those to the sprocket processor. Now, you can see that if we continue to do this with more and more classes as our application becomes more complicated, we're going to end up with a whole lot of classes being created and interfaces being implemented in the DPR file. And so you could imagine that there might be a huge stack of things that get created inside that DPR file as the application gets more complex. So the way typically you deal with that is through a dependency injection container, and that's what we'll take a look at in the next demo. Okay, here in our fourth demo, we'll see our first use of the global container or dependency injection container defined in the Delphi Spring framework. The classes here that we'll use are exactly the same as they were in the previous demo. Only now we're going to register the sprocket, tsprocket, and tsprocket verifier as implementing specific implementations. This will enable the global container to create an instance of tsprocket whenever we ask for a interface of isprocket, and same with the tsprocket verifier class. This enables us to then create an instance of a sprocket using the global container.resolve call. And we simply ask for an instance of isprocket, and we get whatever is registered to that sprocket, to that interface in the global container. The same occurs for isprocket verifier. We then can pass those instances into the sprocket processor and process sprockets normally. You notice again that the sprocket is an interface and the sprocket verifier is an interface as well. This is the global container in action here. It is going to allow you to create instances quite simply and easily through the process of resolving interfaces. However, if you think about it here, all we've done is replace the construction, direct construction, with some indirect construction. And we haven't really gained all that much in doing so. You can see as our application would get more complex, we simply would just have a stack of global container resolve calls as opposed to a stack of constructor calls. So what we want is a way to simplify the creation of our object graph, of our object structure, and we want to be able to do it with a single call to the global container. That enables us to not depend heavily on the global container. It helps us to create a stack of classes that can easily be called and created with a single call to the global container, thus simplifying our application and enabling us to fully decouple ourselves from any given implementation while using the global container to create all of our objects for us. So here in our fifth and final demo, we have created three classes that are now completely constructor injectable by using these interesting attributes. And we'll talk a little bit about how they work here. So first of all, we still have our three basic classes, but now they're all implementing interfaces, including tsprocket processor. But tsprocket processor has this notion of injecting isprocket verifier interface into the class itself. And in addition, we also inject the constructor. And what these attributes do is they tell the global container to automatically create instances of these parameters and this field when this parameter and those fields are first used. And in fact, what that means is you don't even have to create a sprocket verifier. You don't even have to pass in a sprocket verifier. You just simply have to inject the field value automatically. And because the implementations are all registered against the specific interfaces, and because tsprocket processor itself is registered in the global container, we can use the inject attribute to tell the container to automatically create it on first use. And so you can see that the constructor, for instance, doesn't even know anything about fsprocket verifier. And in fact, the constructor also, you'll note, and the DPR file itself doesn't do anything other than create a sprocket processor using a single call to the global container, and then allows it to process sprockets. And just to prove that this works, we'll press the run button, and you'll see the sprockets are properly processed. And again, I want to stress that these inject attributes work because the sprocket processor class is registered with the global container, and because we use these inject attributes to tell the global container to create an instance of tsprocket verifier or whatever is registered against the isprocket verifier interface upon first use. And that is a very powerful technique that allows you to keep your application core, the application root, very simple. One call to one class. All the constructors of the needed interface, needed implementations of the needed interfaces are all automatically created for you as you do that. And this, you can use the sprocket processor with this simple 3 lines of code. Register everything, call a single global container, call to the sprocket processor, and we are past a completely created sprocket processor with all of its dependencies injected into it. And that is the basics of dependency injection. There are lots of learning resources about dependency injection out there on the web. You can search Google with them. But I'd like to recommend 2 books. Of course, naturally, I recommend my own book, Coding in Delphi, which has 2 chapters on the dependency injection, as well as Mark Siemens' book, Dependency Injection in .NET, which is an excellent resource for learning about dependency injection. Don't be deterred by the C# code. It's very easy to read, and the book isn't really a C# book. It's a dependency injection book. Recommend both of those to you. Next up for the developer skills sprints is the IDE integrated project source control using Subversion Mercurial and Git. That's next Tuesday at the times you see there, and I believe that's given by Robert Love.
Allow me to quickly tell you about some of the special offers we have going on right now. As part of our early bird pricing, if you purchase RAD Studio, Delphi, or C++ Builder 10 Seattle, you can save 10% on your license if you purchase by September 30th. Also, registered users of any earlier version can qualify for upgrade pricing. This is a savings of up to 45% off new user price. Update subscription is not required, but still recommended, and everyone also gets access to the free bonus pack. The free bonus pack includes the new book by Nick Hodges, More Coding in Delphi. This covers topics like writing solid code, duck typing, and multi-threaded parallel programming. You also get the new book by Marco Cantu, the Object Pascal Handbook. This is a modern language guide that covers the new features in Object Pascal, as well as some of the core runtime library. The MITA Converter Basic automates some of the conversion of a VCL application into a FireMonkey application, so you can take advantage of multi-platform application development. Also included is the VCL and FireMonkey Premium Styles Pack. This includes styles for both desktop and mobile for VCL and FireMonkey that allow you to really make your application stand out and give it that premium look and feel you want. To find out more information about the bonus pack and these special offers, visit embarcadero.com/rad offer.
And now it's time for questions.
So we got a few questions here. First question, actually, I'm going to ask a question. Are you planning to make your example code available there? Because actually, as I'm looking this even the second time through, I'm thinking I want to look a little closer at the way all of this works. So are you going to make that sample code available that you used in your video?
Yeah, sure. I'll put up on my Bitbucket Nick demo code repository. That should work quite well.
All right, if you send me a link to that.
People can pull it from there.
So in your example code, you use the inject attribute. Does it take any parameters? And if so, what are those parameters and where are they documented at?
It can take a parameter for the name. I didn't have time in the demo to talk about this, but you can register in the global component. You can register interfaces against classes by name, and then the inject attribute can take as a parameter the name that you want specifically. So you could register multiple classes against a single interface and call them by name.
Okay. Now, is that documented? Where is that documented at?
That would be documented in the code, the Spring for Delphi code base. I mean, you just have to look at the attribute class and see that it has a constructor that takes a name parameter.
Do you discuss
an optional name parameter? I believe I do. Yes.
Okay. So is your book kind of becoming the Spring 4D documentation? It sounds like.
Well, I don't know about that, but source code is always the best answer.
That's true. Does the global container destroy or free the objects? If so, when?
Again, I didn't have time to go into this, but I discussed it in my book. The global container can take any. Well, okay. The short answer to your question is yes, it will. And the answer is when the interface goes out of scope. However, you do have control over the lifetime of the items inside the global container. The default is instance-based, meaning that as long as there's an interface connected to it and the interface has a reference, then you will get the object will be valid and it will be destroyed when the interface goes out of scope. But you can also have singleton objects, you can have pooled objects, you can have per thread objects as well inside the global container. Again, not to plug my book too much, but Coding in Delphi discusses all that.
So the question here, how much longer until more Coding in Delphi comes out? Because your page is showing it 99% complete.
Well, the LeanPub says 99% complete because the only way to get the electronic version is to upgrade or have Delphi XE8. So LeanPub, the LeanPub page will only show 99% until my deal with you guys is all expired. So if you want an electronic copy, you have to be an XE8 owner. But the hard copy is available at CreateSpace, and you can get to CreateSpace and buy a hard copy, paperback version from morecodingindelphi.com.
Yeah, so yep, exactly. So go to morecodingindelphi.com, buy your hard copy, and upgrade to XE8, get your electronic copy, and then you have both. That's what I do, and then I try and track you down and get an autographed version.
There you go. I'm happy to do that.
This is David. Hi, guys. Sorry about that. I was muted.
David.
I just also for everyone, if you go to the community site, go into resources, books on the community site, the resource menu, books, submenu item. I've added the link to the book to CreateSpace on the More Coding in Delphi book. You'll find it at the top of the books list, because I put the most recent ones for printed books up in there. So you can get it that way, or I put it in the Q&A, morecodingindelphi.com.
Thanks very much, David.
Sorry about that, guys. I'll go back on mute.
That's fine. Here's a question here. Do you plan to release electronic versions in a common ebook format like EPUB instead of just PDF?
I have an EPUB and a Mobi versions, and if Embarcadero wants to distribute those, I'm more than happy to give them to them for distribution. If you have the PDF and you really, really, really want it right away, you can send me an email at nickhodges@gmail, and I'll send you the link, the EPUB version or the Mobi version, whichever one you want.
Okay. Anything you want to add, or?
No, just thanks for attending, and if you're interested in more coding in Delphi, just buy it.
Yes, it's great to see another Delphi book. We've seen a kind of a proliferation. It seems like there's a lot of people adding more Delphi books lately. So, yes,
Yeah,
as David
I'm
down.
looking forward to reading Marco's new book, so that's exciting.
Yeah, Marco's new book. There's a guy from Brazil, William, that just finished one on FireMonkey that's going to be translated into English as well. Yeah, check
That's
out the
great.
in the chat log as well for more Delphi books, which will
Yeah, and
keep.
I've updated that resources book list. Also, Harry Stahl has a FireMonkey book, both in German and in English. And of course, Daniele Titi has his FireMonkey book. So, but all those books, including some sort of classic older versions of books, are listed under that article. Books has books, ebooks, and some sort of training materials, courseware that's available for purchase or download. So you can look at all of that at again, it's on the community site resources menu books. I'll find the URL. I don't know why.
I'll paste it here in the chat log. I got it right
Oh, you
there.
do? Okay. You might want to
There
put
it is. I see it.
it'll be great to put in your blog post too. But I'll always be updating the book list as authors let me know that they have books available and ebooks. So if those of you out there know of any other books that I've missed, you can send me an email, david@embarcadero.com, and I just edit a single article and it shows up in from that menu item. And Nick, it's always great.
Thanks very much.
Nick gave me the
Thank you.
privilege of writing the foreword for More Coding in Delphi, so that was really fun.
And
And
you did me the
stressful.
honor of doing it.
It's stressful.
Oh no, I
That
didn't
was
want to do that.
It wasn't too bad. Just trying to remember when I was supposed to do it. That was the hard part. What the deadline was.
So now Spring 4D is not included with Delphi, correct?
That's correct. It's downloadable at spring4d.org. I suggest you pull the code using Git. And I think it's Git. I hope it's Git. Yeah. And you can use the code right in your applications right from the source code repository.
And for C++ developers, if they wanted to use dependency injection, that's the simple part, like you showed, is with just passing the constructors in, or how would they go about using dependency injection?
Well, any language at all can use dependency injection. The principle is simply pass to the constructor your required dependencies. Not every class has dependencies, but if a class has dependencies, pass them to the class via the constructor. Don't create them yourself. And that will cause you to be able to easily test your code by passing in, say, mock units, mock classes instead of real classes. And it will further decouple your code as well, because especially if you use interfaces as parameters to the constructor, then you're not tied to any particular implementation, and you're just attached to an interface. And that makes your code much less coupled and much easier to maintain and easier to test. And the language doesn't matter. You can do what I referred to as poor man's dependency injection by simply using constructor injection and possibly setter injection, where you set a property which is an optional. If you have an optional dependency that either you need or you can get along without, then you can use setter injection to set that. But the basics of dependency injection are the constructor declaring the class's dependencies in the class declaring its dependencies in a constructor. And once you do that, then you're doing dependency injection, and there's not a whole lot more to it. The container should be used only to construct your graph, your object graph, for you. In the case where you have a complex object graph, it shouldn't be used as a replacement for create. So I think I mentioned that in the talk, hopefully. So.
Yeah. So you talk about the advantages of dependency injection are easier testing and loosely coupled code. Are there disadvantages of dependency injection?
Well, one of the disadvantages is you can get caught, well, you don't get compile time resolving of your classes necessarily. So you can forget to register something and then call a resolve call on something that's not registered, and you end up with a nil pointer, and that's not good.
Okay.
So here at Gateway, we use a Python script to do static analysis of our code to ensure that all resolved classes are actually registered. So that's one solution to the weakness of runtime checking. So.
Okay. You can share that Python script? Maybe make that part of Spring 4D.
It's very specific. It's very specific to what we do, unfortunately.
Okay. All right. So it's not a generic. Okay.
And I put the link to, both in the chat window and the Q&A log, the link to the Spring 4D Bitbucket URL. So.
Thank you.
Excellent. Great.
Yeah. Thank you, David.
Yep.
Here's a question here. Jens is asking about, he says he hears a lot about the service locator anti-pattern. Is that something maybe you want to tackle in a skill sprint?
I could, if you want. That'd be great. I do believe that the service locator is an anti-pattern. I believe it's a global variable that's used to it can be abused to be simply a replacement for the create call, and you end up with a global variable that contains all of your classes in it. I make the case in coding in Delphi that it is indeed a service locator anti-pattern, and I think I have a blog post of the same name. So if you search for my name and service locator anti-pattern, you'll probably find a blog post by me discussing why that is as well.
Okay, so yeah, it sounds like you got some good coverage on it in your book and your blog post then, so that's good. Good to see. Okay, I think that is to the end of the questions here. We'll certainly make the replay of the questions Q&A session and the original video available up on that blog notes URL you see on the screen, so everybody can check back there later. And we'll also have links to Nick's books and other resources for dependency injection. So thanks again, Nick, for your time and for all you do.
Okay, thanks very much for attending.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for attending, and we'll see you next week for version control system. Yeah, source control. And then I guess, actually, Nick, you're doing some tech partner spotlights coming up here in a few weeks as well on more coding in Delphi. Is that correct?
I'm going to take a couple of coding in Delphi at them. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Nick, and thanks to everyone else, and thanks, David, for helping transcribe the question Q&A log.
Yeah, no problem. It's always hard, but yeah, Nick, I'm going to put the spotlight in the Q&A log in the chat window real quick. Nick is doing, let's see, command pattern on September 10th and aspects and interception on September 24th. So I've put the link. Those are in the tech spotlight, but then there'll be more skill sprints to come beyond this quarter through October through December. Jim and I are working, and we've got a backlog of topics. So as always, send along to Jim and or me suggestions for future skill sprints you want to see via email, and we'll put them into the backlog for skill sprints for years to come.
Yes. Great stuff. All right. Well, thank you, and thanks to everyone, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks very much.